Welcome to Level the Playing Field, where we explore topics related to economics, equity, women, work, and money. My name is Katie Ward, and I'm Commissioner and CAO of Ontario's Pay Equity Commission. Today, I'm speaking with Segan Waldai. Segan serves as Director of Engagement on the Lean in Canada board. She'll be speaking with us about a white paper that Lean in Canada is set to publish on pay equity and women of color in Ontario. Segan, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So before we start talking about the report you're working on, can you maybe tell us a bit about Lean in Canada and how you work to support women?
Yeah, so Lean in Canada, I'll start by saying Lean In started by Sheryl Sandberg. She's the COO of Facebook. And sort of the book was released with the idea of having women sort of lean in at the table. It was released, I can't remember now, definitely a while ago now, but the US started a Lean In sort of group. And that's now expanded to several countries worldwide, including Lean in Canada. And really the objective is it's a community of professional women who are looking to empower each other to build specifically some purposeful and fulfilling careers.
That's fantastic. It is a really wonderful organization, as you mentioned, not just Canada-wide, but global. Yeah. So let's get to the report that you guys are working on. So you've launched a research program or research activity looking at pay equity and women of color in Ontario. Can you tell us how this paper came to be and why it's important for Lean in Canada to be doing this research?
Yeah, so I think, pay equity as it relates to women in particular has been top of mind, I'd say, for a couple of decades at least. I think what really came to be was in the face of this pandemic. Sometime earlier this year, we were all meeting as a board, and it really affected us how much disproportionately this pandemic had affected women. I think as we started to talk about just the disproportionate challenges women were feeling or facing through this pandemic, we felt we needed to do more. It wasn't enough. And so we as a group kind of decided, how can we build more awareness around this? How can we do more to educate women about their rights, especially related to pay equity, and how women in leadership roles can make an impact within an organization. So we set two guiding principles as a board for this sort of program, is what we called it, informing women of their rights to equal pay and how to advocate for themselves, and advocating for pay equity legislation. So as part of this broader thinking across the Lean in Canada board, we partnered with the Pay Equity Office to co-host two events. The first was in April, and the second one was in September on International Pay Equity Day, actually September 18th. And the second part of this was writing this white paper, which was focused on pay equity and specifically women of color. I think it's an important paper that really focuses on education, but also advice. We really, really, really wanted to make it tactical. And we wanted to make sure that whether you were mid-level, whether you were HR, whether you were senior leadership, there was something for you in this paper. And we did that through research, through as much research as we can. And there is challenges when it comes to finding research for women of color and pay. But we did the best we can with the research data that was available in Canada and really wrote out some true steps that we think people can take kind of coming out of that paper. So we're looking forward to its release.
Yes, I've seen the draft, and there is a lot of valuable information in it. And in the draft, your paper mentions intersectionality and how that affects the gender wage gap for marginalized women. Can you explain this for our viewers who may not be familiar with this concept?
Yeah, for sure. So the term intersectionality was I think coined, I'll say, by someone by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw. I think it was 1989, if I remember correctly. It really is an illustration or a term that's used to illustrate how gender, race, class, other individual characteristics sort of intersect with one another and overlap. And really what that means is, while women experience their own forms of discrimination, women who then represent other forms of intersectionality, so let's say women of color, women who are members of the LGBTQ2S+ community, women with disabilities, all of these folks will experience more severe forms of discrimination, sort of a compounding effect. And so when it comes to the pay wage gap, it's effectively more severe for people who are part of this intersectional group. One example is literally just talking dollar for dollar. In Canada, women earn 89 cents for every dollar that a man earns, but that widens to 67 cents for racialized women, 65 cents for Indigenous women, 54 cents for women with disabilities. That's almost 50, that's a half of what every dollar a man is earning. So really an important concept, and one, of course, that we touch on through the paper. That we touch on through the paper.
It is really important to talk about this. And it's something that actually in Lean in Global's recent women in the workforce paper, they talk about the onlys and the onlys. So the impact of being, say, the only woman of color on a team, but being the only woman of color and the only LGBTQ member. So when you start compounding the layers of differentiation from what's considered a norm, rightly or wrongly, starts to impact the effects of gender wage gap. So thank you for bringing that to light in your research.
For sure.
The research also highlights the difference between direct and indirect discrimination. And one quote reads from the draft that I saw: workplace practices that discriminate against women of color are oftentimes systemic, indirect, and not easily identifiable. Can you explain the difference between direct and indirect discrimination and why this is so important to address, or at least bring to light through your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people think of discrimination, they're often thinking about direct. It's the behavior, it's the commentary, it's the very direct, behaviors or rules or policies against perhaps a particular race, nationality, gender, age, religion, sexual orientation. The list continues. And it really can take different forms. I mean, the patriarchy discriminates against gender, racism is against race, homophobia against sexual orientation. That's the more obvious one that people think of. The indirect ones are more subtle ones. The example that often comes to mind for me is an indirect policy at your organization, and I would challenge listeners to think about this, is if you have a policy that, while equally affecting everybody, in your mind, you may think as a leader, well, this affects everybody, it can't be a discriminatory policy. But if that policy uniquely puts a protected characteristic at a disadvantage, that could be a form of indirect discrimination. So an example of that may be if your policy requires folks to work on the Sabbath, well, that may be equal across the board, and you may feel, well, this is equal treatment, but not necessarily. There's a particular group of people who are going to be affected that can't work on the Sabbath. So that's an example of one it's challenging, because it's not, in your mind, you think it's equally treating everybody, but is it equitable? Is it fair? Are you putting people at a disadvantage in that way? And those are incredibly important to address. What kind of culture do you create at work if a particular group feels sort of discriminated against, be it directly or indirectly. So it's really important that organizations try to think differently about what discrimination means to them. It's not the overt. I mean, the overt is equally important. Let's not overlook that. It's just the indirect are the ones that are brushed aside, that are not thought of and need to be sort of at the forefront.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that and for giving some examples. We know from our research related to the gender wage gap, and we've talked about it previously in this series, and we've probably talked about it with your Lean In audience, that roughly 2/3 of the gender wage gap remains unexplained. We have some ideas of what causes it, and that quote unquote unexplained part is absolutely related to unconscious bias and different forms of indirect discrimination. So it's something that we know the federal government is looking at. How can Stats Canada start collecting data around these unconscious and indirect forms of discrimination and bias, so we can better understand not just the gender wage gap, but other gaps in society, and to make society a more fair and just, and as you said, equitable place for multiple differences across the board.
Right. We have a diverse country. I think it's time we started to think differently about how we, especially in the face of this pandemic, if this has taught us anything, we really need to think differently about how we run organizations and what we want to do with our future.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I know you're still in the process of researching the paper at the time of our recording. Maybe if it's done by the time you release this, we'll be including a link for sure. In any case, we'll be promoting the paper. But what are some potential steps that you're already thinking about, or recommendations that you think will be in your final report on, what can our viewers do to be a part of the solution?
Yeah, for sure. So we've got a few of them. I would say, when it comes to your biases, I think the first thing is let's call a spade a spade. Everybody has them, and we need to make sure we acknowledge them, confront them, and do our best as individuals, as Canadians, as proud Canadians, to make sure that we are confronting it head on. And so part of that includes, a lot of organizations now have started offering diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. That is some of the bare minimum that can be offered, and the bare minimum that you as an individual at that organization should be doing. At minimum, go to those trainings, open your eyes, open your ears, and try to take in as much as you can. I went to one recently, and even being in this space, I thought I was aware, and yet I still learned a ton and found myself really having some tough internal dialogue around how I want to proceed forward in my style of communication and what I say and what I don't, and things like that. So really attend that. If you're an organization leader, make sure these initiatives are not performative. These need to be ongoing. These are not a, once a year when something happens in the media that we decide we want to install these into our organization. Make sure you're hiring DE&I staff or appointing DE&I committees, and not just hiring or appointing those that look diverse. Spread the wealth and make sure those that are passionate about the space feel welcomed and are open and willing to take on these roles. The other thing I would say is around hiring policies. So make sure your hiring policies are fair, transparent, and equitable. And I think some of the ways you can do that there are lots of apps, programs, processes that can be put in place to make sure that your HR processes, remove the candidate's name. Try to remove unconscious bias when reviewing applications. Ensure the individuals reviewing those applications are aware of what unconscious bias looks like in the hiring process and are conscious of that as they're going through the applications. Make sure you reveal salary ranges in your job postings. That transparency can be huge, because if you ask candidates what their expectations are for salary, you are forcing candidates to lowball their salary if they're desperate for a job. And really that can be really particularly harmful to marginalized people, especially women, and especially women of color who have just lost a tremendous amount of jobs through this pandemic and are now, trying to return back to the workforce, and who already face more obstacles in the job hunting process. I would say, broader than that, funding intersectional research, if you are in a position to do so as an organization, supporting businesses and enterprises that are owned by women of color, increasing funding for public sector occupations. So I know we didn't get a chance to talk about it today, but certainly in our paper, we've highlighted the challenges with lower paid jobs being the kind of jobs that women our society kind of pushes them into, these nurturing jobs, these caring jobs. It tends to be healthcare, education based, whereas men are often pushed into construction, utilities, things like that. One of the challenges I often, we as an organization should think about is the private sector. Do we call on them to take the lead to publicly disclose salaries? It's not required legally, but maybe that is something that private sector could set the bar by taking that first mover in the space and disclosing their private sector salaries. And I think the last thing is for women, we said this before, for women to move forward in organizations, they need support at home. So encouraging the men to lean in themselves, to lean in both in the, at the workplace and being an advocate for women's equality and advocate for these, steps that I've just shared, but also at home, leaning into the domestic work, sharing it equitably, and doing their best to support their partners or their families where possible, to make sure that the women have the space to focus on their careers and can do what they can in the office. So yeah, those are some of the ones we've at least preliminarily started to think about, but certainly if you read the paper when it comes out in the next month or so, we're excited to share more, and we look forward to hearing people's thoughts.
That is an exceptional list, a very tangible actionable, real recommendations that people that individuals can take. And I like that you covered not just stuff that businesses, managers can do, but also people, people in relationships, or people in supportive relationships, or friends, colleagues. So it sounds like there is a breadth and depth of recommendations coming out with this report. So we'll let our viewers know they can go to leanincanada.com just to learn more about the organization and to follow this report.
Absolutely, for sure. And if you subscribe to our mailing list, you'll be one of the first to get the paper once it's released. And hopefully folks feel exactly that, but there's tactical recommendations. Really wanted to avoid the high level sort of, consider this, and really make it quite as tactical as we could. We want people to finish that article, read it, and have a game plan for the next day. We think there's opportunity to improve things immediately. And yes, there's a lot of work ahead of us, long-term, real systemic changes that need to be made, but there's also small. The small can sometimes be large, especially when compounded across people and across time. So I hope people feel that it's as valuable when they read it, and I look forward to hearing their thoughts.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing the preliminary insights and the preliminary recommendations you have. We're looking forward to sharing this with our audience.
Thank you so much, Katie. It was a pleasure.
This conversation is part of a series published by the Pay Equity Commission of Ontario to examine economics, equity, women, work, and money. You can learn more at leveltheplayingfield.ca. And please share this video on your social platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn so we can elevate the equity conversation.